Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, most honored guest. My speech title, The Farmer and the Bell. Just kind of had a nice ring to it, so that's kind of why I went with that. It's actually more of a whistle. But my story starts January 10th, 1912. Walter Joseph Peterson was born. This is my grandfather. This also happens to be the same year that the Titanic takes off. The Titanic left Southampton seaport, heading over to New York. April 15th, 3 months after my grandpa was born, Titanic hits an iceberg. In less than 3 hours, it takes its final plunge. Just before that, it sounds the whistle for the last time. I'm going to move ahead a few years. October 14th, 1915, Melvina Olson was born. This is my grandma. She's the only child of her parents. On October 14th, which is also her birthday, 1934, her and my grandfather are married. They have 9 children. When they got married, they lived on the family farm for a couple years before they moved across the lake where my grandfather ran a lumber mill and business. I still remember he used to talk about that fondly. He would say, Jeremy, I used to be able to look at that stand of trees over there and I could tell you exactly how many 2x4s or any number of boards I could get out of that and how much we could make out of that just little stand of trees there. But now, I can't do that anymore, he says. 1936, Grandma is pregnant. They're having their first child. The doctor comes out to the house and delivers the Dale. And then to my grandma's surprise, here comes Dallin, right along, right behind her. She didn't have one, but she had 2. She didn't feel prepared for 1, but now she's dealing with 2. Now Dale and Dallin, they were a team. They were pretty good. Later on, he grew up. Dallin started the world's largest home cleaning business. Dale was his VP. That was after many failed business attempts by Dallin. 2 years later, actually 4 years later, Grandma needed a break. 1940, Marv came along. Now, Marv was president of a bank in the cities. Doing great. He's friends with Carl Pohlad. Used to get tickets to the games all the time. Carl owned the bank that my uncle was president of. So I remember going to games and stuff. How do we get these tickets? Well, Carl. So that was great. Marv got tired of the city life and banking industry. Moves back out to right near the family farm and starts up a Army surplus store. A huge difference between bank president running an Army surplus store. He did it great, and it's still successful to this day, even though he's kind of handed on to his stepson now, or his son-in-law. 2 years later, in 1942, Lyle comes along. Kind of notice a trend here. Boy, 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 boy. Now Lyle, he's kind of the troublemaker of the family. If you ask his younger brothers and sisters, he's kind of a little hellion. But it turns out that Lyle goes on and becomes the pastor of the family. He's out in California now, and he's assistant to the bishop and everything out there. He's doing very well. 1944, Jim comes along. Another boy, and Grandma's going, oof, up. He's the second to the youngest of the boys. 1948, Gary comes along. 6 boys in a row. Gary, who happens to be my father. Gary's the only one that didn't go to farm school. Back in those days, they sent you off and you went to farm school, and basically trade school. And is what you're going to do with your life, you're going to go farming. So Gary was the only one that didn't actually go to this farm school. Turns out he was the one that ended up farming. So if you want to push your kids into something, maybe try and steer them away from it first. They'll probably come back to what you want them to do. Now in 1950, Grandma happily has her first daughter, Linda. And Linda grows up, gets married, moves to Alaska. I don't know if it had anything to do with the 6 older brothers or not, but I'll have to ask her someday. She's back living next to the family farm now again. 6 years later comes Renita. This is 1956. Renita is a nurse now, doing great. The year after that is Renee. Now Renee is a very successful businesswoman. So that is all of my grandparents' children, all 9 of them. 6 boys, then 3 girls. In 1987, Grandpa built a chapel. The year prior to that, they decided to build a new church in our area, or they decided to rebuild our church. Our church was built in 1885, I believe it was. So it had been around for quite a few years, and it was about 100 years old, and they decided it was starting to fall apart, needed a new one. So when they tore down the old one, they sold off all the pulpits and pews and everything. Grandpa bought 3 pews and 1 pulpit. And it was always his dream to build a little chapel. So now, to this day, there's a little chapel up on the hill. It's called Cedar Crest Chapel. Overlooks our family farm and our lakes. There's been probably dozens and dozens of weddings up there. It's open to anybody and everybody who wants to go visit. Our first daughter was baptized up there. Grandma and Grandpa now have 40 grandkids.
Oh, wow.
And if you count the grandkids, great-grandkids, and great-great-grandkids, it's well over 100. And then February 16th, 1999, my grandpa Walter passed away. Now you may be wondering why I started off mentioning that the Titanic was also launched the same year that my grandpa was born. Well, 4 days after my grandpa passed, the whistle from the Titanic was blown for the first time since it sank in St. Paul. That was so every time anybody mentions the Titanic, it just reminds me of my grandpa. It seems like the Titanic's whistle brought my grandpa into the world and then saw him out. Mr. Toastmaster.